they decided they were going to take a portion of those royalties and collect them in kind. So they're actually going to receive the physical bitumen, and they were going to have a tender to see who could do the best job of adding value to that. So we won that tender, and we ended up with a 30-year cost of service contract. And that's for 3/4 of the feedstock, and the other quarter comes from Canadian Natural that is on the same terms. So this is what happens to your cost of capital. The normal refiners sit on the left-hand side of this slide, and they've got about a 12% cost of capital, and that's primarily because their balance sheets got so much equity on it. We're on the right-hand side. Because of the quality of the contract that we've got, we can carry 80% debt, and that reduces our cost of capital to less than 5%. So if you think of that 7-point difference, it means we could spend twice as much money on the plant as somebody who's in the 12% cost of capital world. So even though our plant is expensive, it's nowhere near twice as expensive. It's like 10% more expensive than it would be on the Gulf Coast. So by using the cost of capital, by driving it down, we can compete with them on the basis of our processing costs. Big problem number 2, the kind of oil we make in Alberta, it's called bitumen. It's the consistency of peanut butter when you take it out of the fridge. So we have to put things into it to lighten it up so we can put it in a pipeline. But everything we do involves moving that heavy material or heating it up to move it around. And by the end of, and then when we refine it, we have to put a lot of hydrogen in it. And when you make hydrogen, you make CO2 at the same time. So what happens is we're a lot higher CO2 intensity, and this slide shows that. This is a DOE slide, and they looked at the CO2 intensity of bitumen relative to the average US crude slate that runs in a refinery down here. They came to the conclusion, which is right, I think, that we're about 20% worse in our CO2 intensity than a refinery down here running on lighter oils. So there's 3 things you need to have to do something about CO2. And these are colossal quantities. So we make 4,000 metric tons a day. That is about the same amount of CO2 as 400,000 cars make driving around. So these are really large quantities of CO2. First thing you have to do is you have to have an economic place to put it. If you're trying to pay to get rid of it, it's going to kill the economics and the project won't work. Second thing is you have to have pure CO2 because you can't move it unless it's high purity. It turns into a liquid at about 1100 psi, and if I have nitrogen in it, it doesn't turn into a liquid till 4000. I can't afford to pump it out and move it at those prices, and if I try and move it as a gas, it's way too big. And then the third thing I got to get is pipelines, so I need the basic infrastructure to move it around. So no secret, EOR works. You know, there's more than 400,000 barrels a day of EOR, light oil production in West Texas. And that is essentially, in Texas, I can drill a well and get pure CO2. I build a pipeline over to an old oil reservoir and I put the CO2 in it and the oil comes out. In Western Canada, we don't have any wells that we can drill and get pure CO2. So there's an enormous sort of waiting opportunity in Alberta if you can get CO2. And so we haven't had any natural formation CO2, but all these dots on that map are places where CO2 could go in Alberta. These are old depleted oil fields that we know can work under EOR, but we don't have the CO2 to do it. So we think that every part of this industry in Canada is going to be based on man-made CO2. And we think we can put in central Alberta alone, so not all of Alberta, but in central Alberta, we can put about 2 billion tons of CO2 in the ground, and we'll get about 1 billion barrels of oil out when we do that. And where does it come from? It's going to start coming from everywhere. So at the location we're at, we're building our refinery. It'll make about 4,000 tons a day. Across the street from us is a fertilizer plant. It makes about 1,000 tons a day. The Shell Scotford refinery, which is across the river from us, has recently been retrofitted to clean up the CO2 so it can be pure CO2. And then there's a new coal plant, or an old coal plant that's been retrofitted in Saskatchewan called Boundary Dam, and they're capturing the CO2 out of the combustion stream there. So it's early days. They've had lots of trouble with it, but it's starting to work now, and they're selling that CO2 into a field called Mydale that's near Weyburn in Saskatchewan. So this is a map of on the right is the central part of Alberta. We're building about a 150-kilometer pipeline there. It's going to move about 15 million metric tons a day, or 40,000 tons a day, and it's no surprise the route goes through the oil fields. The best red dots on the map, that's where the pipeline goes. Oh, sorry, I'm not very good on the clicker. think it's there. So you've seen the graph before. Top red bar is where we start. Blue bar is where the average U.S. crude slate is, and the bottom green bar is where you get to if we capture the carbon in the refining process. So we start off being about 20% worse. We end up being about 7% better. And we think that, you know, that's an important element of us having a competitive product. I believe that you've got to be competitive on cost, and in the future you're also going to have to be competitive on CO2. And if you're not competitive in both places, it isn't going to work out well. Really good part of this is we're going back, we know where the oil is, we're going back and putting CO2 in it, but we have to do things, we have to re-drill the wells, we have to put in new pipelines, we have to build new batteries, and so it's going to create thousands of jobs, we think, in central Alberta, going back to all these old oil fields. So, same theme, keep progressing from logs to furniture, do that in any way you can, make manufactured products that are highly processed, and you'll be better off. That's my belief. So in Alberta, if we could refine everything we make, we've got about 1 million families in Alberta, it would be $200,000 per year of additional margin for every family that's there. So I don't think we can ever do that. I don't think we can ever create the Gulf Coast in Alberta. But what I think we can do is keep pushing towards this all the time. And the more infrastructure that's built, the more common pieces of transmission lines, substations, roads, pipelines, all of those things make it easier for the next guy. And so you have to figure out, how do I get over the chicken and egg problem of getting that basic infrastructure so I can attract people to the, you know, to the opportunity that's there. And I think the opportunity is always cheap feedstock. So Wyoming and Alberta are quite similar. We got pump jacks all over the place. We got coal mines and trucks driving around, and we got old coal-fired power plants. Sorry. You guys don't have good clickers in Can you go back one for me? Yes, this is not working. Good. Oh, sorry, that's forward. One more. Yeah, there. So you've got all these old coal-fired power plants. Everybody's thinking, well, you know, just shut them down and get rid of the things. My theory is they're power plants, but they're also CO2 factories. And if you think of treating them that way, and you think of what can I do with that, I might look at them in a different way. So I think they're really cheap factories because they're fully depreciated. They were paid off a long time ago. And so I think there is the potential to go back and do something with those things. And that's sort of what I think is, you capture the CO2 from them, you have to provide power purchase contracts. And the reason I say that is because you have to get the cost of capital low enough so that you can afford it. And if you build these with a lot of equity, then the economics don't work. But if you have cost of service power contracts, then you can start affording the infrastructure to clean them up. And I think you have to build infrastructure like we are to distribute CO2. And so depending on how far you go, individual guys can do that. Like somebody like me can do it if it's at the scale we're at, but I can't do it if it's a long pipe. I can't, you know, it's just too big. So you need to think about where's it going to go and how incrementally can I get there. And then the final thing is you can sell electricity that comes out of them. So you have two sources of revenue. I've got CO2 and I've got electricity. The Shale Revolution is making places to put that. So no, I mean, it's too early in its evolution for to need CO2 recovery yet, but that's where it's going to go. There's going to be EOR potential, you know, and all the blue places are places where CO2 can go in the future. So here's the idea. Make lots of jobs retrofitting the coal plants, convert 2,000 megawatts or so. That's going to be 20,000 person years of employment doing that conversion, and it keeps the jobs here, and it also keeps the coal mines and plants in operation. And I know they're old, but they'll run for a long time yet. Now, I'm an amateur, I'm not from Wyoming, I got this on the internet, it could be wrong, but I tried to build up what the costs of electricity might be if you did this. So the red bar is how much does it cost for the facilities to capture the carbon. That's based on the experience of Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan. It's the first one, it's probably high, those costs are probably coming down, but that's the cost of Boundary Dam at our cost of capital. Second thing is, I gotta get the coal to run it, and I gotta pay the people who work in it to run it. I have to compress the CO2 that comes out of it, and that's the little gray bar. then the first thing I get is I get CO2 sales. So I get revenue back, and this is what I think the CO2 would be worth here for an EOR operator. And then the next thing that's, the reason I've got a question on it is I've assumed that you get the same power purchase federal tax subsidy that you would get on a windmill. So that's about 20 bucks a megawatt hour that I think wind energy gets a, production credit. That's the 20 bucks an hour there. I don't see why there's any difference between if I got carbon-free electricity coming out of a coal plant, I don't see why it's any different than carbon-free electricity coming out of a windmill. So I think everybody should get the same production credit, but that world doesn't exist today. So when you end up with all this, you end up with about a $35 a megawatt hour electricity price, which I think is okay. That's okay where I come from, so I think it's probably okay here. So what happens if we don't act? We end up with that. I don't want to be any part of that. It's like we've taken these things down all over the place. It's, what we're doing, and I don't want to be part of that, and I don't think we have to have a world that unfolds that way. So I'm on a mission not to have it. You get to have two choices. You can have, the consumers pay for high energy costs. You get a very few outsourced, low quality jobs, and you get pretty pictures. Other side, pictures aren't so great, but you get lots of jobs and lots of economic activity, and it'll last forever. So I think I'm doing that today in Alberta. There's no reason why it can't be done here. And the whole reason I'm doing it is because I don't want my kids doing that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ian. Great projects, great effort by you and your cohort in Alberta. Certainly lessons for Wyoming. We do want to offer you as well one of our Wyoming trilogy
Great,
sets.
thank you.
So next, we have a value-added panel, and I'll ask Jean to lead this group through our discussion. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I met with a few of my panel members, and after Jack's presentation, we all decided that we needed to find a lot younger group to get up here and talk about what some of the opportunities might look like for the future. But we really appreciate the opportunity to hear the big and bold thinking that you've had in Alberta. And I think we wanted to springboard off of that with the panel discussion today. I won't go through everybody's bios, but we have Sean Reese, and Sean's been with the Wyoming Business Council. He's the CEO since 2014, and he has served on Governor Mead's policy as his policy director from 2011 until taking the CEO position. And Sean is going to talk to us a little bit today about what are some of the foundations that he sees for economic development, particularly at the scale that we're talking about. We have Cindy Crane here, and I'm sure Cindy will have some great thoughts after looking at some of the materials that you've put together, Ian. But Cindy is the president and CEO of Rocky Mountain Power. She was appointed to this position in November of 2014, and Cindy's responsible for delivering electricity safely and reliable to 1 million customers in Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming, and also oversees thermal generation, mining, and resource development for the company. Cindy's got a very long resume with some incredibly deep experience. I encourage you to look at her bio. We also have Martin Kegley with Tata Chemicals, and Martin really brings a global experience to the discussion today. He graduated with a chemical engineering degree from Cambridge University, where he had a number of different roles with ICI and then Brunner Mound Engineering, Production Management. And he has deep experience in the soda ash industry, and he is responsible for, he's the CEO that's responsible for the Western operations here. But Martin has had a lot of different experiences, and he's going to bring a bit of global thinking to the panel. And then we have Tara Ragati, and Tara is with the University of Wyoming. She's the assistant professor of law and the director of the professional land management program at the University of Wyoming. And prior to joining UW, Tara served as senior counsel and CEO at private upstream oil and gas company. Tara's research focuses on energy law, split estates, and natural resource development on federal lands. And given the vast federal lands and the ownership that the federal government has of our natural resources here in Wyoming, we all know that one of our major partners when we talk about undertakings like this is not just the state government, but how does the federal government play, and the various agencies that we work with, how does that have to play into, you know, some of the bold plans that we have. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Sean, and Sean will give us a little bit of perspective on that economic landscape and some of the building blocks that we might need. And we can, if you want, we can just sit and stand, whichever you prefer.
I might stand so I can see this
Yep.
side of the audience.